Well, thank you again to my room hosts for telling me that the talk actually starts at 10:15, so that those of you who came in didn't miss the first 15 minutes of the talk. So please come, take a seat, welcome. Thank you for making the trek all the way out to this end of the conference center. I know it's a long walk from Data Village, but hopefully you'll get something out of it. So you are all here for the deep dive into architecture of Tableau Server on Linux talk. And we are so excited about that we have these lovely Linux hats. We have Linux and Tableau, Linux, Tableau, together at last. My name is Michael Friedman, and I'm on the dev team at Tableau. I'm down here from Seattle. So this content actually originated in our internal dev all hands, and this is architecture content that I presented to the dev team. And the feedback I got when I did that talk in Seattle was, why don't you give this talk to our customers, because they're going to want all of this too. So that's why I'm here, and I'm going to hopefully give you the information that you need to understand why and how Server on Linux works. What were the technical decisions that we made in implementing Server? So this is an architecture talk. I'm not going to walk you through, here's the walkthrough of how you install Server. There's another session for that. But this talk's architecture focused. And if you're looking for more Linux content, I believe these are the talks that are after this one, so I'm not going to send you to talks that have already happened. And please check the app or ask any of the schedule folks for the location, because that may have changed since I wrote these slides. But the titles and the times are definitely correct. So please double check the location for those talks, because that may have changed. The first one of those talks is kind of a comparison for what's it like to change from Windows to Linux. And the second one is about drivers and data source connectivity, and that will walk you through all the wonderful and gory details of configuring ODBC and everything else you need for connectivity. So here's what I'm going to cover. We are going to do an audience participation exercise. It's always my favorite, early in the morning. And then we're going to talk about architecture. So what are the components in the system, and what does client-server interactions look like? So hopefully that's why you're here, because that's why I'm here. So I really do need 6 volunteers to come on down. Please don't be shy. And I will randomly pick people if I don't get volunteers. Volunteers, come on down. All right. You get a lovely instruction sheet, which you can refer to. And you get one. And please just line up straight in front of the podium here.
Do I get one?
Yeah. Do I have 6 folks? For you, one for you, and one for you. So thank you guys. Oh, there is an ordering here. All right. So you are the TSM client? Yep. Controller? Yep. Zookeeper? Yep. Agent? Yep. tabsvc, Visual Server. So thank you guys for volunteering. I know in the morning that is always hard to get people to get up and go. So can we get a round of applause for our volunteers? All right. So please take a second to read your instruction card. Hopefully it will be relatively straightforward. So what we're going to do here is we are going to start Tableau Server. And what I want you in the audience to observe is who is talking to whom down the line, and what do they say to each other, and how does it go? And hopefully, at the end of this, we'll end up with server running, and if not, then we'll have some opportunities for debugging, and we'll go into that too. So, whenever you are ready, TSM client, please start us off.
Give us client's instructions.
Yep.
I'm saying the controller to start the Tableau Server.
Who are you and what do you do? Or what? No, that's wrong, sorry. Who are you and what's your password?
Not me. Password.
That's correct.
Cool, so then I get the Zookeeper the desired state enabled part.
Yep. Can I show it to you? Oh, great. And I hang on. Tell Tableau Server to start and ask for status every 10 seconds.
Status is down.
Status is down. Sorry, Zookeeper. You guys down. What's the status?
Down.
Get another down. Darn. What's the status?
Are you asking me to do something here? It says down until you ask me to start.
Start.
Is it down here?
Tableau Server start. Now what's the
Okay.
status?
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Status now active.
Status is active.
Oh, sweet. Server has started.
Yeah.
Awesome. Server has started. All right. So thank you again, volunteers. I really appreciate the help. In case that made no sense whatsoever and you have no idea what happened, that's what we're going to spend the rest of this talk going through. So you guys, please feel free to take a seat, and as souvenirs for your participation, please feel free to keep your instructional slides.
You can have a server down. Yeah, I thought you would like that.
So thank you again to our 6 volunteers. I really do appreciate that because that kind of makes the entire talk happen. So now let's talk about what just happened and how it happened and why. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about how the TSM, the Tableau Services Manager components interact with each other. So who was talking to who and why. And separation of responsibilities. Because in a client-server system, one of the things we try to develop is separation of concerns, so that one part of the system does one thing, another part of the system does another thing. And you'll learn some of the tools and commands that you can use to debug, diagnose problems on server on Linux. So before we talk about Linux, let's talk a little bit about server on Windows. So hopefully those of you who are server admins know and love tabconfig. You know that Tableau Server is administered on the primary node via 2 executables. So there's tabadmin, which is the command line client, and there's tabconfig, which is this MFC GUI dialog box, which mostly talks to tabadmin to set configuration. And this has worked great for years. It's relatively simple, and the flow for how configuration gets from the entry point out to server is relatively simple. So the source of truth is config files on the primary node of server. Those are tabsvc.yaml, which has all of your user settings, configdefaults.yaml, which are all the defaults that Tableau ships with. And then you generate config by running tabadmin or tabconfig. And there's the templating process, and if you've ever looked at workgroup YAML, physical server properties, all those files get generated. And then we repeat this on every node in the cluster via the distributed Ruby endpoint, DRB. and the tabadmin worker process, which is running on every machine in the cluster. So this has worked well on Windows for years, but it has some limitations. And we wanted to address those limitations for server on Linux. The first limitation, and this is a big one for Linux, is that it's Windows only. Tabadmin has some direct dependencies on the Win32 API, which is great for Windows. Lets us interop with the operating system directly. Doesn't work at all on Linux. Tabconfig is an MFC application, which is a Microsoft-specific technology. So if we wanted to port tabconfig to Linux, we'd need to first port it to Qt or some other platform-agnostic dialog. We didn't want to do that. There's some other larger issues that are not really platform-specific, but they're things we wanted to address for server on Linux. There's no remote access whatsoever. You have to log in to the primary node and run commands locally. And similarly, there's no authentication model. So the logical authentication model is, can you log in and can you run tabadmin, which by default, because we install into program files, is, are you a local administrator on that Windows system, which is okay, and you all can deal with that via groups and policy. It may be a source of pain because you may have to justify to IT, why do you need to be an administrator on the box? But that's the authentication model, and it's not very flexible. So in Tableau Services Manager, which is the kind of replacement for tabadmin on Tableau Server on Linux, we've changed from the client application generates all the config to client-server model. So the admin tools themselves are client-server. The TSM command line, that's the name of the executable, it's just TSM. So that's the replacement for tabadmin, is a REST client. It doesn't actually do anything, which if you saw in our audience exercise, our TSM client volunteer wasn't the one who was starting processes and writing configuration. It's just a REST client. So you post to an API endpoint, and the server does some work. The service endpoint for the admin system is called controller, tabadmin controller, and you'll see that process referred to later in this talk. That was one of our volunteers, was the controller process. And that exposes a REST API endpoint. And then the server applies all the actions to the managed service, which is Tableau Server. So how does everything run? If we have a server endpoint, that means you need to have a server process. And because this is the admin endpoint, it's running even when Tableau Server itself is stopped. So on Linux, we integrated with systemd. Systemd is kind of the modern equivalent of initd. Systemd has its detractors. It's controversial among some folks, but it is relatively widely supported. Tableau Server on Linux must have systemd present in the distro. And this is one of the big factors for our distro support story. If you've installed Server on Linux, then hopefully you've done so on CentOS 7 or Ubuntu 16 LTS or Fedora or Red Hat 7. Those are all distributions that support systemd. If you are wanting to run Server on Linux on another distribution, you need to have systemd. The notable exception that a lot of people have asked us about is Amazon Linux. However, there's good news. Amazon has recently announced a beta version of Amazon Linux that supports systemd, which means that it's going to be feasible for us in the future to support Amazon Linux for server on Linux. We're still evaluating that in-house. It's not available yet, but it is definitely on the roadmap for us to support Amazon Linux. Systemd is the parent process for all of the TSM services. So, and that's literally, if you look in PS tree, the parent-child process. And if you come from a Windows background and you're wondering, what am I talking about? When I say systemd, you can think Service Control Manager. So your good friend services.msc is the Windows Service Manager, and it's kind of logically equivalent to systemd. So let's run some command line stuff, because this is a Linux talk, and I have to show you command line. So the most useful systemd command you're going to run all the time is systemd or systemctl status. So systemctl is the name of the command line for working with systemd, and the status command is just status, and then you tell it what you want the status of. So this is the service name of tabsvc. That's tabsvc_0. And you get back a ton of information from this. You get back the friendly name, the Tableau Server Service Manager, and you get back the path to the service file. So if you're familiar with systemd, this is the definition file that says what's the executable that this runs, what's the configuration, and well, it's a file. You can go look at it. You can look at all the configuration, see what we've done. You can see that it's running. That's good. And we have pretty good uptime. This one's been running for 2 months. So again, there's a lot of information here. You also get the process ID. So if you want to poke around more with other tools, here's the process ID. You're going to need that. And you get the control group, which is basically the group of processes. And this has the tabsvc process itself, right? This is the same PID, process ID. And that's the path to the executable. So it's this long path. And we'll talk about this path in a little bit more detail on an upcoming slide. We also got the child processes. And these are all the Tableau Server processes you know and love. So here's Postgres, here's Backgrounder, and for space purposes, I've omitted the rest. And again, if you're coming from a Windows background, the logical equivalent to this is scquery, or any of the other Windows command line tools for interacting with Windows services. So when you think systemd status, it's just, is the server running? So now you know if the server's running or stopped. You probably want to start or stop it. So all of the admin endpoints are normally always running because they're the admin endpoints. And if you want to do anything with Tableau Server, the admin endpoints need to be running. If you need to start or stop them for debugging or troubleshooting or whatever your local purposes are, the commands to do that are sudo systemctl start tabsvc0, sudo systemctl stop tabsvc0. And that will start and stop server respectively. And again, this is not how you normally start server. This is how you shut down the admin endpoint if you need to shut down the admin endpoint. And you need to run these as root because the Linux permissions model. In most environments, you can query status without escalating privilege. There are SE Linux policies that do require that. So if you have problems with status, try running it as sudo. But you will always have to run start and stop as root. And there's no output to the console from these commands. But if you look at the log file, it'll tell you. And here I conveniently have the path to the log file. There's another long string. And this is the log line that tabsvc logs when it shuts down. It says shutdown hook finished. Means it stopped. So that's systemd. Question. The question is, do you need root access to install Tableau Server on Linux? And the answer is yes, absolutely. You need root access to install Tableau Server on Linux. Once you install Tableau Server, you don't need root. You only need root to install. You don't need root to then work with config and start and stop the server. You'll need root again to upgrade, but most of the time you don't need to be root unless you are unless you need to mess with systemd.
I don't see the hyper here.
So the question is hyper. So hyper is one of the Tableau Server processes. So kind of for the purposes of this talk, I'm mostly talking about the admin endpoints. So these are the components that you use to start, stop, configure, take backups, all the things that tabadmin does. Server itself has a whole bunch of processes, right? There's physical server, there's visportal, there's backgrounder, there's Postgres, there's Apache, and now there's Hyper. So Hyper is one of the child processes of tabsvc. So Hyper will be running when Tableau Server is running. Hyper will be stopped when Tableau Server is stopped. So Hyper is the drop-in replacement for Tableau Data Engine. So everything that you expect about Data Engine running, Data Engine stopped, is also going to be true about Hyper. Great.
When would you need to start and stop the TSM?
When would you need to start and stop TSM? So as I said, the admin endpoints are normally always running, even when server is stopped. But I can't predict the future or your environment. Like maybe you need to take an extended maintenance window and shut the server down. You want to do that cleanly. You want to stop the admin endpoints. You should just be able to reboot the server and everything will start back up. But if your environment, you want to do a clean shutdown of everything, that's how you would do it. All right, I'm going to keep going, and please ask questions. And as I said earlier, if they're short, I'll just answer them. If I'm going to answer them later, then I'll say that I'm going to answer them later. And if they're long, then I will invite you to follow up with me later. So you may remember some of these components from our audience volunteers. We had the tabadmin controller, which is the front door for the admin services. So this process handles authorization, orchestration, and it's the REST API endpoint. We have tabadmin agent, which is the go configure things on each node in the cluster. It executes commands. And we have tabsvc. Tabsvc is the parent process of all of the Tableau Server processes like Hyper and vSQL Server and visportal. And this is basically just the parent container for Tableau Server. We have Zookeeper, which is the coordination service, and we use that as distributed source of truth. And the license service, which deals with licensing. If you shut the licensing service down, then server will not be happy with you and refuse to start, so make sure the licensing service is running.
Does the TSM use the same Zookeeper as the Tableau cluster?
Yes. TSM uses the same Zookeeper instance as the Tableau cluster, which has some implications for start-stop, which I will cover on a later slide. So if you want to understand kind of where Tableau Services Manager is coming from, on one slide, it's this slide. If you want to make a change, so you want to change a configuration value, or you want to add a backgrounder, or you want to start server, or stop server, or take a backup, anything that changes the state of server, then things flow from the controller. They get written into Zookeeper. Agent sees them, and then agent will go run some service command to make that happen. The controller has a REST API, which is a fun thing that we get to talk about, because this is the first time that we've had a REST API available for admin. So there's the Tableau Server REST API that lets you work with content, sites, users, groups, permissions, workbooks, all that. But we now have a REST API for administering server. So you can, if you want to, if you don't like our implementation of the TSM client, it's just a REST API. You can code against it yourself. The docs for this are still in flux. It's still in beta. So some of the REST API details may change over course of release. Stay tuned. So let's talk a little bit more about tabadmin controller. The tabadmin controller is the HTTPS endpoint for the REST API. And when I say HTTPS, it is HTTPS only. You can only interact with the admin endpoint securely. It is secure by default. We generate a self-signed certificate for it, and the TSM client knows to trust that certificate. It's also the authentication endpoint. So if you want to use the REST API, oh, question.
I was going to ask Michael, will a customer want or be able to change that HTTPS certificate?
Question is, will customer be able to change that HTTPS certificate? That is a feature request that is on the backlog and coming in a future version of the product. It is not available in the current beta release, but we know that people want that, and we know that that's going to be a requirement for a lot of organizations to deploy, is to replace the self-signed cert with a IT-issued cert. All of the business logic for orchestration, so anything that has to run across multiple processes, lives in this process, tabadmin controller. And I haven't talked about managed product keys yet. I don't know how many of you know and love managed product keys, but that's the dialog box for interacting with server licensing. That is now going to live in this process as well, tabadmin controller. And that also means that licensing is available via REST API instead of just on this MFC dialog that you have to run locally. And the important thing to know about, from the architecture perspective about controller, is that it doesn't implement any of the service actions. So the way that, oh, question.
Regarding the licensing,
Mm-hmm.
if I have 8 core and if I buy another 8 core, if I update the key through REST API, I don't have to restart or anything, right? It's automatic.
So the question is about licensing, and if you have to.
Maybe in the scale-up situation, will this work?
So if you add additional capacity, do you have to restart server? And the answer to that is you should do whatever it says in the docs, because I don't remember the answer to that, but I know our docs say something about it. And if they don't, then they will, right?
Yes, sir.
Great. So tabadmin controller does not implement any of the service actions itself. So if you remember our audience demo, tabadmin controller gave that desired state enabled card to Zookeeper, and then agent saw that and responded. And that's kind of the paradigm for how everything works in Tableau Services Manager, is that you issue a REST API request, controller makes a change, that gets recorded in Zookeeper, agent sees that change and acts on it. So let's talk about a little bit more about authentication, since the controller is the process that deals with authentication. And this is, I think, a model that I hope you guys are going to like, because it's going to be more flexible than what we have on Windows. So we delegate authentication, which is the question, who are you, to the host operating system. So if you have an account on the host operating system, then we know who you are. The operating system knows who you are. And we delegate authorization, which is the question, are you allowed to do this thing that you want to do, to the host operating system group membership. And these are things that if you're an IT admin, you may be thinking to yourself, oh, I know how to configure that. I know how to set up accounts. I know how to manage groups. Those are things I can do. In Windows, you can do this with Active Directory. There are dozens of different ways you can do this on Linux. And this is a neutral statement. So however your environment deals with accounts and groups should just work with Tableau Server. And we haven't seen a command prompt in a while, so let's drop back down to the command prompt. When I log into TSM, the command that controller is going to use to check am I authorized is this guy, ID-GN, M. Friedman, my username. And we get the output of these are the groups that I'm a member of. If you see wheel, that means, well, I'm probably running on something that looks like Fedora. This is the group that gets you root access by default on Fedora-like distributions. You also see Tableau and TSM admin. TSM admin is the group that is used by default for authorization. So any user who's a member of this group is allowed to use TSM. And you can configure that via whatever policy you want, because that's none of our business. A question?
Can you say the TSM admin has a run as admin in Windows? Can we combine both of them?
The question is, can you combine the run as user and Compare. Oh, yes. So this the authorization model is a concept, and I talked about this a little bit on the Windows slide back in the introduction. There is kind of no equivalent of this on Windows. The Windows authentication model is, can you log into the primary, and can you open an elevated command prompt, right? And this is kind of the equivalent of that, except this should be easier to configure because it's users and groups, and you can configure users and groups. Question?
Are these Tableau and TSM hard-coded or
The question is, are the Tableau and TSM admin groups hard-coded or are they configurable? And the answer is, of course they're configurable. Why wouldn't they be configurable? So yes, they're configurable. These are the defaults. So if you just run the install with no option overrides, this is what we'll set up for you. But if you have your own groups you want to use for this, you can use your own groups, and you can configure server to use these groups. Question?
So when you're doing installation for the licensing, do you still do, if you don't have access to do an online activation, is the offline activation pretty similar to what it is today? Machines where you create a file and you have to send it off, and you receive a file from Tableau, and then you put the file on the activation file.
Yep. So the question's about offline activation. The flow for offline activation on Server on Linux is very similar to what it is on Windows, which I know is not something you're probably happy about because the flow is a little painful. Yeah, you have to generate the offline activation file, upload it to Tableau from some network accessible machine, get the response file, bring it back to your air-gapped machine, and then apply it. One thing that we have done with Server on Linux and the offline activation flow is if you have been through the offline activation flow, and I'm guessing you have, there's a round trip where you have to do that cycle twice. You only have to do that once on Linux. We fixed that at least. A little better. Question?
is TSM admin a local group or LDAP
The question is TSM admin a local group or a LDAP group? And the answer is we don't particularly know or care. By default, it's a local group, but if you change the config setting to point it to an LDAP group, then it's an LDAP group. Yeah, yeah, so, and if you combine what you just asked and what I just told you, that means that you can control authorization to administer Tableau Server via LDAP groups, which is hopefully something you guys want. Login continued. So we already checked authorization. Let's check credentials. So I'm not going to put my username, my password here. But we check credentials by piping the username and password with appropriate sanitization to this helper utility, check password, and here's the full path to it. And it exits with a code. It's either success or failure. And this delegates to su, so the su command. And the only reason we have this is for pseudo-term handling. Su is kind of finicky about is it being run on a terminal, and this thing emulates a terminal well enough so that su is happy. And you may be asking, why are you doing that? And the reason we're doing that is because we delegate logon attempts for TSM to the operating system, which means that if you have IT auditing policies on your operating system, then they apply to TSM. And so that way you get throttling, auditing for logon attempts, logon successes, logon failures, however you have it configured in the operating system, and it's none of our business. It should just work because we delegate. And that is, again, an improvement, we think, over Windows because you get auditing and throttling and policy all by default. So hopefully that's a thing you guys like. All right, so we talked about authentication, and now we're logged in. Let's actually do something. Let's go configure server. So we want to configure server. The equivalent of tabadmin set is TSM configuration set, and it'll take a key value pair or a formatted config file if you want to do it in bulk. And as we've been talking about, the TSM client is just a REST API. So the client's going to send a patch request to the controller, which is the REST API server. So that processes the request, sends a response code, and then the client receives the response and prints success. And if you are familiar with REST in general, HTTP payloads, this is what the HTTP payload is. It's patch. Here's the URL for setting configuration value. And here's the payload. And this is JSON. This REST API supports both JSON and XML, which is another thing we're excited about. Question?
Can we encrypt the password put it in the server so that we can send the encrypted password instead of texting the encrypting REST API?
So the question is, can we encrypt the password and send encrypted password to the server, to the REST API? So the answer to that is not currently. We may consider doing that in the future. The motivation for that is the REST API is only accessible over HTTPS. So it's already encrypted in the transport. We never send the password. Mm-hmm.
Some organization doesn't allow you to use the password in your scripts.
Yes. So if you can't use the password in your scripts, I believe the login command accepts password input via a password file. So you can write password to file, lock the file down so it has read-write permission only by one user. And I don't remember if it also accepts environment variable, but there are options for not putting the password on the command line. Configuration, cool. So as we've talked about before, the server endpoint handles updates by writing an update to Zookeeper. So the server is going to receive the API request, and it's going to write something to Zookeeper. So we're going to write a new configuration into Zookeeper. And once we get an acknowledgement of the write, then we will send response to the client. And if you look at what the contents of the config are in Zookeeper, it's got this config.version:17, a bunch of config. Here's the config value that we tried to set, foo::bar. And you may be familiar with this format because if you've ever looked at tabsvc.yaml, that's what this is. So tabsvc.yaml now canonically lives in Zookeeper, and that's how it gets distributed across the cluster.
You mentioned in the last session that if it's a call that requires a restart, that it's an automatic restart. Is that the case?
So the question's about restart and automatic restart. And I don't know if this change is in the 10.5 beta release or if it's coming out in the next beta, but we added a confirm option to every command that's going to restart server so that no surprises. We will only restart server if you tell us it's okay to restart server. Tabadmin agent. So agent is the other big, another question.
In the distributed environment, do you give any option to take particular node offline completely so that I can do batching, restarting without affecting and then bring it back? Do you give any option to take it offline and make it online? That's a very requested feature, right?
So the question's about in a distributed environment, can you take a single node offline and bring it back online? We haven't really done anything with server on Linux that's different from server on Windows in that regard, but that is a feature request that people have asked for, so it's something we will definitely consider. Yeah. Tabadmin agent. So agent is going to run on every node in the cluster. So this is the execution endpoint. So if you're running in a clustered environment, you need to have the execution endpoint running on every node so you can execute commands on every node. As we saw in our demo at the beginning, the agent process watches Zookeeper for changes in the state of the system. So if you update the config, or you add a backgrounder process, or you add a new node, then the agent process is going to see that and process it. So when the config changes, we will deliver the new config file and then tell every service to configure itself. Upon topology changes, we'll deploy any new services and remove any ones that have been updated. The other thing that agent does is status reporting. So because it's running on every node in the cluster, it can ask all the local services, are you running, ping everything, and then report that back. So we get central status reporting for the status page. One of the things we've tried to do with agent is it has very little knowledge of the Tableau services business logic. So this tries to be generic about the differences between vSQL Server and vSPortal. All of the configuration-specific logic for the Tableau processes live in those processes. So as I said, agent watches for configuration changes in Zookeeper. And when the configuration changes, agent will process the updated tabsvc.yaml and tell the services to go configure themselves. So there's a change in Zookeeper, agent sees that change, and agent runs the service configure command. And here is what one of those service configure commands looks like. I realize this is tiny text, but our paths are all kind of long. And the thing I want to highlight here is that we tell the services to configure themselves. So there are these control applications, and each service, each Tableau server process has one, and that knows how to configure that process. So this will run some Java code that's going to run the SQL Server configuration workflow, and SQL Server ends up configuring itself. So the agent process is just responsible for making sure that everyone sees the right version of tabsvc with new config values, and then the services go do what they need to do. And the goal for this is isolation, robustness. So if you have some problem with SQL Server config, it's not going to affect your backgrounders, your viz portals. So one of the common questions we always get about server is the run as user. So what's the account that Tableau Server is running as? One thing that's important to know about Tableau Server on Linux is that the run as user is not configurable after install. You can configure the run as user account when you install Tableau Server. So you can provide an option on the command line when you are installing Tableau, but you can't change it afterwards. So you want to plan your deployment, know what account you want to use, have that all set up and ready. If you don't override that, then by default, Tableau Server is going to run as the Tableau user, and the agent process is going to run as the TSM agent user. And this has some consequences for groups and permissions and file ownership. So if you look at the server data directory, the server data directory is var op tableau tableau server. And if you're coming from Windows, you may see this and just think C:\program data tableau tableau server. That's the same thing, var op tableau tableau server. And this has config, data, logs, temp, just like you'd see on Windows Server. These are owned by the agent user, but they are group read-writable by the Tableau user. So Tableau is the user for all of the Tableau Server processes, but the agent ends up owning the files. Question?
How about password changes?
Password changes.
Run as accounts, like on a Windows server, to change your password, you'd have to go change it in the services area.
Yes.
Stores the password there.
So password.
In the configuration area of Tableau, stores the password. Does that get stored on a Linux server?
So by default, we create the Tableau and TSM agent users as no login, no password. So they're daemon users. You can't log into them. They don't have a password, so you can't change their password. If you want to configure them to be local or LDAP accounts that do have a password, then you need to keep track of that password, but we don't store it in the config anywhere. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so I think so. So if you needed to change the password, like LDAP password, since you're not storing it anywhere, you don't need to worry about it.
Right. Right. With potential caveats for if you're using the run as account for Kerberos delegation, in which case go read the docs page because it's kind of complicated. Or go to the data source connectivity talk where I hope they'll talk about Kerberos. So why are there two users? Privileges and separation of concerns. So we use the sudoers mechanism that most Linux distributions provide to grant the TSM agent user permissions. So these are things that the TSM agent account can run as root. And you can just go look at this file. It's a text file. So you can easily audit, like, what are the permissions that Tableau wants so that it can run as root. It's a very limited set. It's mostly updating the systemd service definition files for our own processes. So we can remove and rewrite our own service definition files. You have to do that as root. So this is how the agent process can escalate. But again, it's a very fixed set, and you can just go look at the file, and you can audit what is Tableau asking for to run as root. And the great thing about this model, at least we think, is that Tableau Server can't execute any of these actions. So the Tableau account cannot escalate to root. So if there's a vulnerability in Tableau Server, you can't exploit that to get root access. The Tableau account doesn't have root access, doesn't do anything as root, doesn't have permission to run anything as root. So there's a security hardening advantage to this approach on Linux. All right, let's take a second and recap, because I've just thrown a ton of architecture information at you guys. And the big picture that I want you to take away from this talk is unidirectional data flow. So if we want to change the config, or we want to add another backgrounder, or we want to do anything that's going to change how Tableau Server is running, data always flows from the client to the controller process, to Zookeeper, to the agent, and then out to the services. And this is one-way data flow, and this is canonical. Like, this is the only way that changes propagate through the system. Goes in this direction. And hopefully you saw that in our audience demo, where whenever anyone asked someone else to do something, that always went from this side of the room towards that side of the room. One thing I haven't talked about very much yet is status. How do we do status reporting? How do we know everything's running? That is also unidirectional, but it's the other direction. So the services report their own status, and the agent sees that and aggregates it, posts it to Zookeeper, where controller will see that, and then the status, either the command, TSM status, which is very similar to tabadmin status. It has a -v option. It'll tell you what every Tableau server process in the cluster is doing. And then we'll report that, or the REST API, or the status page in the web UI. And again, this is unidirectional. So whenever we're trying to gather information about what's happening in server, it always flows this way. And hopefully that happened in our demo, where when vSQL Server reported that it's running, that information went from this side of the room to that side of the room. Oh, and I set up the demo in the right direction so that the side of the room that we did in the demo is the side that the arrow goes on the screen too. I'm happy about that. And again, this is canonical, so the data always flows in one direction. So let's look in a little bit more detail at status. You may remember from earlier, the configure command ran this application that's specific to the vSQL Server process, and it runs a status command. So services know how to ping themselves. So, and this is again kind of an isolation robustness thing. If you have a problem with vSQL Server that it doesn't respond to pings, that's not going to affect status reporting for backgrounder or for Hyper or for any of the other worker processes. And these things output a JSON blob. This thing just says it's running, says what time it is. Every service knows how to report its own status. And that all gets posted back to Zookeeper. There was a question earlier about is the Zookeeper process that the admin services, the Tableau Services Manager, uses the same as Tableau Server? And the answer is yes. Note that this is a difference. So in the classic model on Windows, Zookeeper is running as a child process of tabsvc. This is not true for Server on Linux. Zookeeper is one of the TSM services. It's going to be running all the time, and it's running as a child of systemd, not tabsvc. So expect to see Zookeeper always running. Again, unless you're trying to do like a full shutdown and you deliberately stop it via sudo systemctl stop. The functionality of Zookeeper is largely the same. It's a distributed source of truth, does eventual consistency, makes sure everyone in the cluster sees the same config and we don't get into split brain. So if you remember from 2 slides ago, we had this JSON status blob. This gets posted to Zookeeper, and it lives at this znode path. So if you've ever spelunked into Tableau Zookeeper storage internals, this is kind of the location in Zookeeper where we store this information. And this is the status blob that is going to get reported by the status API. It just says, yeah, physical server, it's supposed to be running, it's enabled. It is running, and here's the last time we heard anything about it. So that gives you status information. And this is all available from the REST API and the TSM status client. All right, so again, I've thrown a ton of information at you about how everything is different on Linux, except for tabsvc. So in Windows, tabsvc is the parent process of all the Tableau Server processes. In Server on Linux, tabsvc is the parent process of all the Tableau Server processes. So this is a thing that is still the same. One of the cool things we can do is PS tree, and we can see tabsvc is the parent process of Redis, which is cache server, backgrounder, cluster controller, data server, so on and so forth. And again, Hyper and TDE would both fall in here. And the last thing that we saw in the demo was that services ask tabsvc to start them. So again, there's this control application, and this thing has an enable command. And this thing, the services actually ask tabsvc to start them, which is a slight difference from how Windows works, where tabsvc knows declaratively what all the commands it needs to run are. So when you start one of the Tableau Server processes, the agent runs this enable command, which actually has an API client on the tabsvc process, and then tabsvc will start the service. All right, that is the end, unless you want to all see what the instructions were, but that will be available in the recorded content. So how are we doing for time? Oh, I'm almost over, but question? Questions about the sudoers file? What do you want to know about it? So what are we adding to the sudoers file? So when you install Tableau Server on Linux, we will update the Tableau Server sudoers file so that we can write the service definitions. So basically the systemd definitions for this is tabsvc, this is Zookeeper, this is agent, this is controller. We also, there's one thing that licensing needs to run as root, and firewall. If you have firewall D running, then we will need root to open firewall ports. I don't remember if we publish the contents of the sudoers file in the docs page, but if you install Tableau Server, you can just look at the file. It's a text file, and you can see these are all of the things that we need root for, and it's a pretty short list. Does that answer your question?
Okay, so that is for basically this TSM to run as to node of it.
Yes.
Have you done any benchmark with Linux, in Tableau and Unix versus Windows with same configuration and same Tableau versus performing good?
Questions about performance benchmarking, comparing Windows and Linux. Yes, we have done performance benchmarking. The expectation is that some workloads are going to be faster on Linux, some workloads are going to be faster on Windows. A lot of that comes down to driver differences. So it depends on the data source. As far as Tableau Server itself, we think we should perform just as well on Linux as we do on Windows, if not better. One of the things that we want to get from the beta, and if you're not signed up for the 10.5 beta, sign up for the 10.5 beta. Send us performance feedback, because evidence from customers in the wild, if you give us a workbook that is slow on Linux but fast on Windows, and you give us that in the beta, then that's a thing that we're going to go fix. So my encouragement, call to action, sign up for the beta, install server, restore a backup onto server, test your content, let us know if you have slow workbooks. Yeah. Question is it possible to do a mixed cluster between Windows and Linux? And the answer is no. It's also not possible to do a mixed cluster between different Linux distros. Every node in the cluster has to be running the same distro. We'll see if people want that, right? Like if a lot of customers ask us for it, then that may be something we go build in the future. But certainly in the current release, no, that is not supported. Yep. Questions about Docker. We've had some people prototyping with Docker with success. I think what we want to do with Docker is similar to what we've done with a lot of the server open source tools, where if you want to run Tableau Server in a Docker container, we'll put that on GitHub, and all the config for that will be available. Yeah, I would love to see you guys build us Docker templates for running server. Certainly if there are things that we need to go fix in server to enable that, then again, sign up for the beta program, test it out, let us know what works, let us know what doesn't work. But yes, people are definitely interested in Docker. Kind of our main focus so far has been like getting server running on traditional Metal or on traditional VMs, but Docker's on the roadmap. Great. I am supposed to remind you guys, once I get to through here. So these were all this guy. Please complete the session survey in the app. Let me know what you thought of this talk, if you want to see more talks like this. And this is an architecture talk. Again, I'm not giving you the walkthrough content. The goal with this talk was to give you the whys and the hows, like what is the architectural thinking that we have for server on Linux. If you guys liked that and you want to see more of that, then let me know in the survey. If you didn't like that and you don't want to see more of that, let me know in the survey. So thank you guys very much. Yeah, and I'm going to stick around here for at least another 10 minutes, and I'm happy to answer any one-on-one questions.